I'd like to introduce one of the funniest men of our time, a man that I greatly admire.
Oh, Jackie Vernon is here tonight. He's a very funny guy on stage.
Jackie Vernon went from voicing America's favorite snowman to starring in a cannibal horror movie. Then he vanished. Now, the truth about his final years is coming out. The empty suitcase collection that baffled his friends, the Vegas shows that nearly broke him, and the tragic secret his family kept hidden until now. This is what really happened after Frosty the Snowman, and why nobody wanted to talk about it. Jackie Vernon was born Ralph Vernon on March 29, 1924, in New York City. He grew up in a working-class Italian-American family. Life in his neighborhood was tough, but full of character. His family valued hard work and humor, and those values shaped him from a young age. New York was a city of contrasts. One moment, you could hear the sounds of jazz spilling out of clubs. The next, you'd be walking past a street vendor shouting about the best hot dogs in town. Jackie soaked it all in. His childhood was filled with stories, laughter, and the struggles of working-class life. He went to high school in the city and later enrolled in City College. But something else was pulling at him. He loved making people laugh. His humor had a dry, almost sleepy quality that made even the simplest jokes funnier. Still, comedy was just a dream at that point. The war changed everything. During World War II, Jackie served in the U.S. Air Force. Military life was strict, but it also introduced him to people from every background. He listened to how they talked, noticed their habits, and learned how humor helped people get through hard times. Even though he wasn't performing yet, his time in the service sharpened his ability to observe. That skill would become his greatest weapon later on. After the war, Jackie returned to New York and tried to settle into a normal life. He gave college a shot, but it didn't feel right. Comedy kept calling to him. In the early 1950s, he started performing in small clubs, but the road was anything but easy. He played in nightclubs where the audience barely paid attention. He performed in strip joints where people came for the dancers, not the jokes. Some nights, the crowd laughed. Other nights, they didn't even look up. But Jackie kept going. He was different from the comedians who talked fast and filled the stage with energy. His style was slow and deliberate. He would deliver a joke with the same sleepy expression, no matter how funny it was. That unexpected delivery made it even funnier. He soon realized that his slow, deadpan style was his secret weapon. At some point, he decided he needed a new name. Ralph Vernon didn't sound like a comedian. It didn't stick in people's minds. So, he became Jackie Vernon. It was simple, easy to remember, and fit the persona he was creating. That name would follow him for the rest of his life. Jackie Vernon's career changed in 1963 when Steve Allen saw him performing at a nightclub in Windsor, Ontario. Allen liked what he saw and invited Vernon onto his late-night show, Celebrity Talent Scouts. That one appearance put him in front of a national audience for the first time. Almost overnight, everything shifted. TV producers started calling, more invitations came in. He booked performances at top venues like the Hungry Eye in San Francisco and the Blue Angel in New York. These were places where the best comedians performed, and Vernon proved he belonged. His slow, deadpan style was different from anything else on television. He had a way of drawing people in, making them wait for the punchline, then hitting them with something completely unexpected. Audiences loved it. That success made him a regular on some of the biggest shows of the time. He appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and The Dean Martin Show. Each show gave him a chance to reach new audiences. On The Ed Sullivan Show, he performed alongside musicians and other comedians, proving he could hold his own in any lineup. On The Tonight Show, he and Johnny Carson played off each other, showing Vernon's ability to think on his feet. One of his most memorable performances happened on The Dean Martin Show. He wasn't just a guest. He sometimes opened for stars like Dean Martin and Judy Garland. That kind of exposure took his career to the next level. He became a trusted name in comedy. Producers knew he would deliver. Viewers knew they would laugh, But what truly made Jackie Vernon stand out were his strange, offbeat sketches. The most famous was the Vacation Slideshow. This routine became his signature. He stood on stage holding a hand clicker, pretending to flip through imaginary vacation slides. Each picture came with a bizarre, deadpan description. The humor wasn't just in the stories, it was in the way he told them. Always serious, always slow, making the ridiculous details even funnier. In one slide, he described dropping coins at a toll booth and struggling to find them under the car. In another, he talked about picking up a hitchhiker who immediately pulled a gun on him. The audience never saw any actual slides, yet they could picture every moment. That was the genius of his act. Jackie Vernon was not the obvious choice to voice Frosty the Snowman. Before this role, he was a nightclub comedian known for his slow, dry humor. His jokes were often aimed at adults, filled with subtle punchlines that caught audiences off guard. Nothing about his style seemed fit for a cheerful, child-friendly Christmas special. Yet somehow, he became the voice of one of the most beloved holiday characters of all time. When Rankin Bass set out to create Frosty the Snowman in 1969, they needed someone who could make the character feel warm and full of life. Frosty wasn't just a talking snowman. He was playful, innocent, and excited by the world around him. He had to sound like a friend. They could have chosen an actor with a high-energy, exaggerated voice, but that wasn't what they wanted. They needed something natural and charming. That's what made Vernon's performance so special. His voice was calm, steady, and full of simple joy. He didn't try to force emotions or play up the comedy. Instead, he gave Frosty an effortless warmth that made him feel real. His delivery of "Happy Birthday"
Happy birthday!
became an unforgettable catchphrase, not because it was loud or over the top, but because it was genuine. Frosty sounded like someone who was just happy to be alive, and that was enough. The special became an instant holiday tradition. It aired on CBS every year after its release, becoming a Christmas staple for generations. Vernon's voice played a big part in that success. His Frosty was friendly and lovable without ever feeling silly or exaggerated. He made the character feel timeless. Vernon returned as Frosty in 2 sequels, Frosty's Winter Wonderland in 1976 and Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July in 1979. These specials expanded Frosty's story, letting Vernon bring even more personality to the role. In Frosty's Winter Wonderland, Frosty falls in love with a snow woman named Crystal. This gave Vernon a chance to show a more tender side of the character. He played Frosty with the same warmth as before, making the romance feel sweet and innocent. By the time Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July aired, Frosty had become a true holiday icon. He was no longer just a character from a song. He was as recognizable as Rudolph or Santa Claus. The fact that Vernon returned each time proved how important his voice had become to the character. No one else could capture Frosty's charm the same way. Jackie Vernon was an unlikely choice for Frosty, but that was what made his performance so memorable. His background in adult comedy might have seemed like a strange fit, but his natural delivery gave Frosty a voice that felt real. He didn't overact or force the character to be something he wasn't. He simply let Frosty be Frosty. That decision turned a simple Christmas special into a timeless classic, and it made Vernon's voice a part of holiday tradition forever. Jackie Vernon kept himself busy throughout the 1970s, performing stand-up and making regular TV appearances. He had already built a name for himself in the 1960s with his signature deadpan delivery, and by the next decade, he had become a familiar face in the entertainment world. He was a frequent guest on shows like The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, The Merv Griffin Show, and The Dean Martin Show. These appearances didn't just showcase his humor, they helped him stay relevant in an industry that was constantly changing. Vernon was a popular opening act for stars like Judy Garland and Dean Martin. He He was the kind of comedian who could win over almost any crowd, whether it was in a packed nightclub or on national television. His influence on the comedy world was clear. His dry, slow-paced delivery paved the way for future comedians like Mitch Hedberg and Stephen Wright. He wasn't just a performer. He was a blueprint for a certain kind of comedy. But if there was one place where Vernon truly thrived, it was at celebrity roasts. These events, where comedians and celebrities took turns poking fun at each other, were huge in the 1960s and 1970s, and Vernon was a regular. His deadpan style made him a standout. He had a way of delivering a joke with such a straight face that it made everything twice as funny. He roasted big names like Milton Berle and Ed McMahon, holding his own against some of the biggest comics of the time. Part of what made him so effective at these events was his ability to take a joke, as well as he could deliver one. He would sit there, stone-faced, while the other comedians took their shots at him, then respond with a perfectly timed comeback. It made him a favorite at these events and cemented his reputation as a master of his craft. Vernon also left behind a handful of comedy albums that captured his unique brand of humor. Two of the most notable were A Wet Bird Never Flies at Night, 1964, and Sex Is Not Hazardous to Your Health, 1972. These albums showed different sides of his comedy. The first leaned into his classic self-deprecating humor, painting him as an unlucky everyman trying to navigate life's little absurdities. The second album was a bit edgier, tackling more adult themes while still keeping that same detached, ironic tone. Both albums were well received and gave fans a way to enjoy his comedy long after his performances were over. Then came something completely unexpected: Microwave Massacre, 1979. If people knew Vernon as the dry-witted stand-up comic, or even as the voice of Frosty the Snowman, they probably didn't see this one coming. In this low-budget horror comedy, he played Donald, a construction worker who accidentally kills his wife, then develops a taste for human flesh. The film was bizarre, darkly funny, and totally different from anything he had done before. But that was part of what made it interesting. Vernon's deadpan delivery made the absurdity even funnier. The film wasn't a hit when it first came out, but over time, it became a cult classic. Fans of So Bad It's Good cinema embraced it for its weirdness, and Vernon's performance played a big part in that. Vernon often joked that even as a kid, he wasn't popular. He once said, "Dale Carnegie once hit me in the mouth," a line that perfectly summed up his signature style, turning personal misfortune into comedy. He saw himself as a sad clown, much like Charlie Chaplin, someone who could make people laugh while still carrying an undercurrent of melancholy. His humor was rooted in real insecurities, and while it resonated with audiences, it also boxed him into a certain image. He was always the underdog, the guy who never quite caught a break, and that became both his strength and his limitation. That typecasting was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made him a household name. He was a favorite on The Tonight Show and The Dean Martin Show, and he even became the voice of Frosty the Snowman in the beloved holiday special. But on the other hand, it trapped him in a niche. Producers saw him as one thing and one thing only: the lovable loser. No matter how much talent he had, no one wanted him to be anything else. The frustration of being stuck in that image became even more difficult in the late 1970s when variety shows started to decline. The format that had given Vernon his biggest opportunities was slowly disappearing. Audiences were shifting toward sitcoms, stand-up specials, and new styles of comedy. Vernon's brand of humor, which relied on dry, slow-paced delivery, didn't fit as neatly into this new landscape. The work became inconsistent, and so did his income. For someone who had spent years performing at top venues like the Hungry Eye in San Francisco and the Blue Angel in New York, the sudden downturn was jarring. He had been in movies, done voice work, and made countless TV appearances, but now, steady gigs were harder to come by. He had a family to support, his wife, Hazel, and their children, and the financial instability weighed heavily on him. He adapted as best he could, focusing more on live performances in places like Las Vegas, where he still had a strong following. But the security he once had was gone, and he had to hustle to keep going. Despite the challenges, Vernon never stopped being who he was, an eccentric, deeply unique comedian with a perspective like no other. His quirks were legendary. He had an odd habit of collecting empty luggage, an unusual pastime that baffled many. It wasn't just a random hobby. It fit perfectly with his comedic worldview, finding humor in the mundane, the overlooked, and the absurd. To him, something as simple as an empty suitcase could be a source of amusement. And then there was his kleptomania. At least, that's what his fellow comedians called it. While on tour, Vernon had a habit of swiping small items from his friends. It was less about theft and more about playful mischief, a way to pass the time on the road. The comedy circuit in the 60s and 70s was a close-knit world, full of pranks and inside jokes. Vernon fit right in, adding his own offbeat humor to the mix. His fellow comedians respected him. They knew he had a gift for seeing life through a different lens, for taking everyday struggles and turning them into something funny. Even as his career slowed down, he remained a beloved figure among those who understood what he had contributed to comedy. Jackie Vernon's marriage to Hazel Sawyer was a defining part of his life. They married on October 27, 1958, and had 3 children, David, Lisa, and Tracy. Their marriage lasted until his death in 1987. But like many entertainers of his time, Vernon spent much of it on the road. His career as a comedian meant late nights in clubs, long tours, and constant travel. He performed in venues across the country, from the Blue Angel in New York to the Hungry Y in San Francisco. The spotlight followed him everywhere, but it also pulled him away from home. Hazel held things together while he was gone. She managed the household, raised their children, and provided stability in a life that wasn't always predictable. After Vernon's passing, she remained active in her community, remembered for her warmth and kindness. She passed away on March 21, 2006, at the age of 77, leaving behind her children and a grandson named Gage. Despite the challenges that came with Jackie's career, his family stayed close. His children have spoken fondly of him, remembering both his humor and the quieter moments when he was simply their father. His son David often described him as a sad clown. It's a familiar image, the comedian who brings laughter to others while carrying a quiet melancholy of his own. Vernon's humor was often self-deprecating, his delivery deadpan and understated. He played the role of the unlucky everyman, the guy who just couldn't catch a break. Audiences loved it, but that persona also reflected something deeper. The pressure of performing, the constant time away from home, and the ups and downs of a career in comedy likely weighed on him. This idea of the sad clown had roots in one of his biggest inspirations, Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin had mastered the art of comedy mixed with pathos, making audiences laugh while pulling at their emotions. Vernon admired him for that. Early in his career, he wrote letters to Chaplin, hoping for advice, maybe even a connection, but Chaplin never replied. That didn't stop Vernon from looking up to him. Chaplin's ability to tell stories through expressions, body language, and perfectly timed humor stayed with him. Vernon built his own style around that same idea, comedy that felt effortless but carried an underlying depth. Years later, Vernon finally met Chaplin. What happened next was something he never expected. Chaplin told him he had been following his career all along. The man he had admired for so long had been watching him too. For Vernon, that moment was more than just a meeting with an idol. It was validation. By the late 1970s, television comedy was changing fast. Variety shows that once made Jackie Vernon a familiar face were disappearing. Programs like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Dean Martin Show were either ending or evolving into something different. Even The Tonight Show, with Johnny Carson, had shifted its focus. Comedians who built their careers on these platforms found themselves with fewer opportunities, and Vernon was one of them. His style, dry, self-deprecating, and slow-paced, was falling out of fashion. Audiences were drawn to newer comedians who brought more energy and edge to their performances. Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, and others were pushing boundaries in ways that made older acts seem outdated. Vernon's approach still had its fans, but he was no longer in the spotlight. His son, David, later said that health issues may have played a role in his decline. By the time Vernon passed away in 1987, he had already spent years away from mainstream television. But even though his public presence faded, those who remembered his prime still saw him as a comedy pioneer. Even as TV opportunities dried up, Vernon kept performing. He found a home in Las Vegas nightclubs, where he could still connect with an audience that appreciated his humor. The atmosphere was different from television, but it allowed him to keep doing what he loved. The problem was, these performances didn't bring him back to mainstream success. The comedy landscape had changed too much. Younger comedians dominated television, and the venues where Vernon performed, while respected, didn't have the same reach. He appeared in films like Microwave Massacre, 1979, and Amazon Women on the Moon, 1987. But those projects didn't make much of an impact. His shows in Vegas were well received, but outside those rooms, he was slowly being forgotten. Comedy had moved on, and while Vernon remained a legend to those who grew up watching him, to many younger audiences, he was a name from the past. One thing that kept his name alive was his role as Frosty the Snowman. The 1969 animated special was a holiday classic, and Vernon's voice became inseparable from the character. He reprised the role in Frosty's Winter Wonderland, 1976, and Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July, 1979, ensuring that generations of children would grow up hearing his voice. But this legacy came with a downside. For many people, Frosty the Snowman was the only thing they knew him for. His decades of stand-up, his television appearances, and his film work were all overshadowed by that one role. It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept his name alive. On the other, it boxed him in as a one-hit wonder. This wasn't unique to Vernon. Plenty of comedians and actors have found themselves forever linked to a single role. But for him, the contrast was especially stark. Frosty was a family-friendly character, while his stand-up had a dry, often adult humor that didn't quite match. Jackie Vernon's final years were a mix of resilience and struggle. His health had been in decline since the mid-1980s, but he never let that stop him completely. He still found his way to the stage, even if his performances became less frequent. Comedy wasn't just a career for him. It was a part of who he was. His self-deprecating humor and signature deadpan delivery had made him a staple in the industry, and he wasn't about to walk away from that without a fight. Even as his body weakened, his love for performing never faded. Just before his death, he took the stage at the Marina Hotel in Las Vegas. It was one of his last shows, a reminder that no matter what was happening in his personal life, comedy was always his refuge. He had spent years making people laugh, and he wasn't about to stop now. His health struggles weren't new. They had been creeping up on him for years, but he never used them as an excuse. Instead, he turned them into material, folding his own challenges into his routines. That was the kind of comedian he was, someone who found humor even in the hardest moments. It made his work more relatable, more genuine. He didn't just tell jokes, he shared pieces of himself with his audience. Through it all, the comedy world still held him in high regard. His influence was undeniable. Younger comedians, including Stephen Wright and Mitch Hedberg, saw him as a pioneer of deadpan comedy. They studied his timing, his delivery, the way he could say something completely absurd without ever breaking his straight face. Jackie Vernon wasn't just another comic. He was a blueprint for the generations that followed. Offstage, his personal life gave him stability. He was married to Hazel Vernon, and together they had 3 children, David, Lisa, and Tracy. His family was a quiet anchor, a constant presence even as his career and health fluctuated. In the end, They were the ones who stood by him through it all. Then came November 10th, 1987. That morning started like any other, but by midday, Jackie Vernon was gone. He was at home in Hollywood when he suffered a heart attack. Hazel had gone to work that morning, and when she returned for lunch, she found him unconscious. Paramedics arrived, but it was too late. At 12:06 p.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 63 years old. The news hit the comedy world hard. No one had expected it. Vernon had complained of back pain the day before, but there had been no real warning signs, no history of heart trouble, no indication that anything was seriously wrong. It was sudden, shocking, and deeply felt by those who knew him. His passing marked the end of an era. Deadpan comedy had lost one of its greatest figures, a man who could take the most ridiculous scenario and deliver it with complete seriousness. His impact didn't fade, though. His style, his timing, his ability to find humor in the ordinary, it all lived on in the comedians he inspired. Years later, his son David reflected on who his father was beyond the jokes. He saw him as a sad clown, much like Charlie Chaplin, a performer who made the world laugh while carrying his own struggles in silence. That image stuck because it was true. Jackie Vernon was more than just a comedian. He was a man who found humor in life's difficulties and gave that gift to others. Even in his final days, that never changed.